Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to the book club questions and answers session with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. It is a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to connect with all of you today, our global audience, to discuss the three wonderful books we have covered in the previous sessions, which were Martin Sherwin's Gambling with Armageddon, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, and also Rashid Khalidi, The 100 Years War in Palestine. And many more are coming, so please continue to be engaged with us. In this sense, today, the objective of this call is to have a more circular conversation with our readers, with our book club readers from all over the world. So please submit your questions in the questions and answer feature of the platform, so we can call on you, so you can formulate a question to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and he can address it. Before we start, I'd like to share a disclaimer to make sure that everyone knows and be advised that this session will be recorded and included in the SHG Academy library and potentially other platforms as an open educational resource in this webinar or other type of formats. Having said that, let's dive in to the session. Hello, Jeff, how are you today?
Good, great to be with everybody. Thanks for joining, and I hope we can dive more deeply into these three fantastic books that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Great. So just to start, I'd like to pose some general questions that I think the audience will benefit from, and then we're going to start calling on our audience. So Jeff, would you please share a bit about how the book club was conceived and came to existence? I think it's a fantastic story. And also why you felt compelled to create it at this time, and also how you choose the books that we are reading together.
Yeah, well, it's very easy. I would, I think it's would have been useful anytime, but this is definitely a COVID spinoff, because one of the facts of COVID during the past year has been taking a break for a long walk from all of the shelter at home, especially in the the very heavy days of the pandemic. And my discovery, actually, because I had never really done it before, of listening to audiobooks on the walks, and so suddenly during the past year, I've spent time to listen to dozens and dozens of fantastic books. And the books were so good, so interesting, these new histories that we had in the first three sessions, and many that are coming up, that I wanted to meet the authors. So I thought, okay, I could give them a call, of course, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have a chat together? And so this is, as you know, I discussed with you and with our colleagues at SDG Academy, and decided we would have this kind of conversation. I'm enjoying it a lot, and it's been a great chance for me with these first three authors, and we have some fantastic authors ahead, to really dive more deeply into very, very powerful works. History at the best.
Absolutely. And also a reminder to everyone in our audience that actually the second podcast is already out, based on the conversation that Jeffrey Sachs had a couple of weeks ago with Professor Rothstein on The Color of the Law. Great. Thank you, Jeff, for that. The other question that I thought that was resonating across our audiences in the three conversations was this reflection on the connection between the issues discussed in the book club, whether it's issues about peace, conflict, racial segregation, inequality, and so on. And we're going to be touching on issues of the economy, how to make it more inclusive, more just, and sustainable development, and the SDGs particularly. And so for those that are not yet so familiar with the SDGs, could you please give us, I know you have so many courses already, and please go and everyone to our SDG Academy courses to learn more, but just maybe a brief framing of what the SDGs are and how are they relevant to overcome these issues.
Sustainable development is really our compass, I think. It is a concept adopted around the world that says we should have societies that are prosperous, fair, and sustainable environmentally. And peaceful, because SDG 16 rightly talks about the rule of law and peaceful and inclusive societies. So the idea of sustainable development is a holistic idea of well-being and how to promote it. And I think we learn a lot from history. We find out things about our societies that we would not know. And I found in each of the three books that we've talked about some profound lessons for how to make our world more peaceful and thereby more prosperous and more inclusive. So Gambling with Armageddon is about the fundamental survival of humanity. And I think we can never learn enough about how dangerous it is to have the nuclear weapons around. We really need to be on a path of denuclearization. We're not right now, but it's important that we do that. And I thought that Martin Sherwin's book was not only brilliant, but extremely powerful in helping us to understand how risky the nuclear, the nuclear arsenal is. Then the next two books, Richard Rothstein's Color of Law and Rashid Khalidi, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, are about social divisions, and in both cases about the terrible plight of communities that are dominated by more powerful groups. And in The Color of Law, it is really a history of the de jure segregation in the United States. And the more one learns about US history, truly the role of brutal racism, white supremacy as part of American culture and history is ever present. And if you want to understand Trump, who, in my opinion, was as mean-spirited and dangerous to America and to the world as any president we've had, read Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, because it explains how someone like Trump can come to power. And it's important to understand that. And people don't know the history. I didn't know the history as deeply as I should have. But the fact is, until you read the work of a great historian, you don't know. And the book by Rashid Khalidi that we discussed about the Israel-Palestine conflict, that conflict's almost always told from the Israeli perspective. That is usually conflicts are told by the victor side, as it were. And Rashid Khalidi tells a very both personal story, because his family has been in Palestine's leadership for generations. And he tells the story from the point of view of the world's leading Palestinian historian on the question of Palestine. And so it's a remarkable book, and so important for us to see a conflict that's usually described in the US press from a very different perspective, to be understood from the perspective of the Palestinians and all of the hurt and harm that continues to this day because we don't have a just solution. So I found that also very powerful for the issue of sustainable development, which is about inclusion and social justice.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff, for that. I agree, and there's so many commonalities that we can see and draw. So I would like now to bring the book club readers so we can hear their questions and bring them to the live.
Yeah, please don't be shy, everybody. Let's. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reactions. Doesn't have to be a question; it can be a comment also.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do now, we're going to start enabling the mics and the videos of different individuals. We'll ask you to, each of you, please introduce yourself, mention where you're connected from, and formulate your question or your comment to Professor Sachs. We have about 35 minutes, so please keep your questions or comment brief so we can hear from many people. I think the first person that we have, I think, is Samshad Marine.
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, SDG Academy, and for making this platform, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs to be with us. I'm from Bangladesh, and I'm teaching at the University of Dhaka.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, it's late night.
Oh,
so
thank you for staying up late.
No, I'm so delighted to hear from you. So I have two questions. From both the books, The Color of Law and The 100 Years' War on Palestine, we can see there is imbalances of power which result in inequality. So during COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, we are going through this crisis. Is there similar thing happening or different outcomes we can see from those examples given in those books? This was the first question.
Great, Samshad. Thank you. Maybe just one question per person, if we might, and if there's time to come back to your second question. But just on that, you know, there are big inequalities of the impact of the pandemic, but they're complicated in a number of ways. First, different regions of the world have really lived through different experiences. In general, the countries in East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand have contained the virus much better than other parts of the world. So the impact has been less in terms of disease and even on the economy. So that's one kind of difference. You know, how well has the government been able to implement public health measures? A second kind of difference within a society is, are you in a employment or a job that could go online, for example, and so work could continue? Or are you in work in a shop or a restaurant or some sector that had to shut down, for example, or had to continue, but in very dangerous conditions like frontline health workers? So a second kind of inequality is that. A third kind of inequality is that whenever there is an adverse blow to economic life, people that have financial cushions, that have some wealth, have the ability to withstand the harm better than people who don't have any financial wealth. And as you know, in Bangladesh and so many parts of the world, there are people that basically live day to day, hand to mouth. And this has been extremely hard for such people because they've lost their remittance income, they've lost their jobs often, they've had extra expenses because a family member became sick. Also, there's an inequality because people live in different housing conditions. And when housing is crowded and in slum crowded conditions, the transmission of the virus might be almost unavoidable. And so this is another kind of inequality. There's been an inequality between men and women, with many households locked down because of restrictions. There's been a rise of violence against women in many places in the world. So any big dislocation will have inequalities, and this definitely has big inequalities. I would add also that one part of the world has internet and another part of the world does not. And the part with internet has been able to weather this storm much better than the part that does not. So having said all of that, the question is what to do about it. How do we make a more fair world? And that is what our multilateral system should be helping to do. The WHO should be helping to ensure that everybody gets the vaccines on time. The World Bank or Asian Development Bank should make sure that investment doesn't plummet during this period, so that infrastructure continues to develop. The IMF should make sure that governments that are losing revenue right now because of weak economy, closed down economy, but at the same time have major urgent areas that they have to spend to stop the epidemic or to help people who are suffering. The IMF should be helping those governments get the emergency funding that they need. Is this happening? To some extent. Is it happening enough? Absolutely not. So one of the reasons I have to finish today's discussion a little bit early is that I have a call with government shortly in which we're going to discuss how to make the financial system globally a more fair and equitable system, because we don't have that kind of fairness and equity right now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Yes, Samshad, thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Great. I think we have next Suleiman. Or can be otherwise. I think we might have Jackie. Or anyone else. I think Paul as well. I think we have a few in the audience already lined up.
Can they raise their hand, actually?
I think so.
Or
Yes.
Suleiman is there, yes.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. The organizer, I would like to thank Professor Sachs for taking time to discuss with us. I'm from Burkina Faso, that it's in West Africa, and I'm taking the master class with University College Dublin in Sustainable Development.
Excellent, Suleiman. And I know Ouagadougou well, of course.
Okay, thank you. And my question is as follows. In a world with competition and mistrust between nations, how can we bring together nation and companies to work together to solve some of our challenges, meaning the energy crisis?
Absolutely. You know, I think that a key part of any solution is diplomacy and dialogue. We need to interconnect the world more with brainstorming, problem solving, building solutions, building understanding. I'm a big believer in the UN system for this reason. It should be the system that helps us to understand each other and to find common ground. It is a difficult thing to do. It's surprising to me that even though we are digitally interconnected, we are not culturally or politically interconnected the way we should be. Countries yell about what's happening in other countries rather than talking to people in other countries. The United States makes every complaint against China, but it doesn't have enough diplomacy so that we can exchange ideas and learn from each other. And this is really important. It's why, by the way, I really like the United Nations. I live nearby, and in normal times, I would walk to the UN 2 or 3 times a week. And there are diplomats from all 193 member states talk to each other. They're typically very civilized. The discussions are very important. And while the diplomats by themselves don't solve the problems because the politicians usually have the upper hand, the diplomacy is very important to find the common areas of agreement. And one way specifically to bring this about, of course, is to negotiate legal frameworks like the climate change framework, the Paris Agreement. Because if we have a common legal document, then we have a clarity about what governments are responsible for. And it doesn't solve all of the hard problems, but by having a common framework, we can at least partly hold each other's governments accountable to make progress on that framework. So I think my basic answer to the question is diplomacy. And interestingly, in Professor Sherwin's book, he talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there were two groups of advisors of President Kennedy when this crisis came. There were the military and there were the diplomats. And the military said, go bomb Cuba. And the diplomats said, go negotiate with the Soviet Union. And thank God the diplomats won in the end, because if the generals had had their way, we would have had nuclear war. But the diplomats were smart enough to know that we didn't want nuclear war. We needed negotiated solution. And President Kennedy's genius was to side with the diplomats, not with the generals. It's often very hard for a president to not support the generals. But Kennedy knew what he was getting as advice from the generals was extremely dangerous. And it was much more dangerous than the generals knew, because they didn't realize that the Soviet missiles were already in operation. And if the US had tried to bomb them, those missiles would have been launched and the US would have had a nuclear attack. And then we would have had a nuclear war, and maybe the whole world would have ended at that point. So the lesson from that book is diplomacy. Talk, don't fight. and when you do talk, you can really find a lot more common ground than is otherwise expected. And that's certainly my experience as well. When I get a message from somebody and it just looks really rude or nasty, and I am about to respond in an absolutely hostile way, and then I calm down and say, maybe I should talk to the person. Often it turns out, well, the message, I misunderstood completely what they were saying. And so, the dialogue was really the key, not jumping to conclusions. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of that international dialogue. But if we did, we would get much farther in solving the problems. Good to see you, Suleiman.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Welcome, Jackie, go ahead.
Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Jackie. How are you?
Nice to see you. I want to tell you how much I've been enjoying these your book club and these sessions. The books that you've shared with us, introduced us to so far, have just been fantastic. I could ask questions about all of them. I found myself wanting to ask questions during the conversations themselves, but I would like to actually build on what you were with my question on what you were saying about gambling with Armageddon. Just incredible, fascinating, stunning, beyond interesting. What I took away from that, among all of the things you discussed with the author, was the sort of the lack of intelligence that seemed so central to what was happening and impacted the diplomacy and the actions that were taken. Unless I completely misunderstood that, it felt like that to me. And so digital technology, right, has been such a savior for creating shared knowledge, and making fact-based decisions possible in a way that they were probably not at that time. And yet it feels to me that if we were confronted with the same circumstances, we would get just as dangerously close to the edge as we did then. I was wondering if you could tell me how you think about that and how you think the author might be thinking about that.
Yeah, well, excellent question. I think there's a concept of the security dilemma, which is a concept that was launched by a colleague of mine at Columbia, Professor Jervis, in the International Relations Department. And the concept is that we could all observe the same event, but understand it completely differently. And generally, in this security dilemma, the idea is that the move that one side makes in a tough bilateral relationship is viewed as aggressive by the other side, even when it's mainly defensive by the country carrying it out. And so you have two sides, each taking actions, and each one thinks they're taking a defensive action, but viewed from the other side, it looks incredibly aggressive. And so you get an escalation, and then you end up with a conflict. And this is not exactly the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's not unlike that story, because from Khrushchev's point of view, he saw a few things. First, that the US had these short-range nuclear missiles in Turkey and in other countries in Europe, pointed at the Soviet Union, right on the Soviet border, basically. And so from his point of view, putting missiles in Cuba was not aggressive. It was a kind of response to the US action. Whereas from the US military point of view, that was about as aggressive as could possibly happen. And one of the stunning facts that Sherwin explains in the book is that President Kennedy knew almost nothing about the missiles in Turkey. He had to be briefed after the fact. He didn't really know that they were there exactly. And so the idea of how it looked to Khrushchev versus how it looked to Kennedy was completely different, even if the facts were the same. Then there was many precedent events to the crisis. For example, the US had flown a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union shot down in 1960. And when it was shot down, Eisenhower, who was president, thought that, was told by the CIA that even if a plane was shot down, it would never survive, it would just disintegrate and the pilot would die. And so Eisenhower was encouraged to tell a lie about what happened. So when the Soviets said, "We shot down your plane," Eisenhower came out and said, "No, that wasn't a spy plane. That was a weather plane that went off route from Turkey." Well, the Soviets not only had shot down the plane, it had come down in full big pieces, and the pilot was alive. And they captured him, Gary Powers. And so they knew everything about it. And so not only was the US spying, the US was lying bluntly about this. And then I think in the discussion I mentioned that when the US invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs in the spring of 1961, and that was a miserable failure of a typically stupid CIA operation, Kennedy lied about it completely. And so from Khrushchev's point of view, these guys are just liars. Every time they open their mouth, they're lying to me. And they've got the missiles there. So he decided he'd kind of get even, also protect Cuba. And this is not how the Americans viewed it. The Americans viewed it as, you know, Soviet military on the march to dominate the world. And when Khrushchev told Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister, that he was thinking about doing this, Gromyko thought it was crazy and said, "What do you want, a war?" And Khrushchev said, "Are you kidding? Of course I don't want a war. This is just to give them a little bit of taste of their own medicine." So the facts were the facts, but how they were interpreted is completely different. And this is why I talk about the foreign policy of Jesus Christ. And the reason I do is that in the Gospels, Jesus says to someone that is criticizing somebody else, "Why do you point to the mote in the other person's eye, the speck in the other person's eye, when you have a beam in your own eye? In other words, why are you complaining about the other person when you're not even taking care of your own situation? Well, this is wisdom teaching. This is basic ethics, which is rather than just going off on someone else, you try to contain some self-control and be in a position to make such an assertion. But in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States was spying on the Soviet Union, had lied repeatedly, had invaded Cuba, and had lied about all of it. So lying, invasion of Cuba, and missiles in Europe pointed to Russia. That's a lot of provocation, actually. And if we were thinking in Jesus's terms, we would say, well, yeah, maybe from their point of view, our behavior is not perfect. Maybe we should think about that. Now, when Martin Sherwin tells this story, there's one person who thinks in those terms, and that's John F. Kennedy. Thanks God. Because what Kennedy wanted to know from the beginning is what is Khrushchev trying to do? The military never even asked the question. They just said, we got to bomb them. We got to take out the missiles. Whereas Kennedy was asking a question. What is Khrushchev doing? And Kennedy deeply intuited that the solution to this was to understand the other side. And Adlai Stevenson, who's one of the heroes of the story, was a diplomat. And so he understood, talk it out, don't shoot, talk it out, figure it out. And so I think that this is why full information is not enough, or what we consider full information. And we have exactly this situation now vis-a-vis China, because China is building, is arming some of the small islands in the South China Sea. And we say, oh, look at how completely aggressive China is. Whereas China looks at the same map, and if you look at the map, China is surrounded by American allies, by Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, India, and we go visit them and say, you joined the alliance against China. And China sees that its sea route, which is its sea line of survival, is threatened, but explicitly threatened. And so why do we say it's Chinese aggression rather than trying to de-arm both sides to make sure that the sea lanes remain open and do nothing to give China the sense that we're trying to surround China? But instead, the Secretary of State, on his first trip to Asia, goes to Australia, Korea, Japan, and the Secretary of Defense goes to India to form what they call the Quad, which is the 4 countries that are supposed to surround China. And then we wonder, why is China uneasy about that? So I think the point is, so much of this is not fact, it's interpretation. And so much of it is like you would, in a sophisticated way, interpret your relationship with another person. And you try to figure out, why don't they like me? Or what are they misinterpreting? Or maybe we should sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk this thing through. And that, to my mind, will save the world if we would have that as the basic idea, that first, whatever you think, look at your own behavior first. That's Jesus's advice. Think about the beam in your own eye first. Second, talk it out. And Kennedy said something extremely important. I wrote a book about a speech that he gave in 1963 about making peace. And he said that the key was to understand the other side is human, and they want the same things we want. And so when you start from that point of view, boy, can you reach a win-win outcome. This is, I think, the real story of Sherwin. We're not going to solve this by, better cyber and so forth, because we're going to interpret everything wrong in the end. Of course, more transparency could help, but a lot more diplomacy would help even more.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's a wonderful lesson for leadership, self-awareness and so on. So I really appreciate that. Now I think we have Paul Shaw as well.
Hello.
Hi.
Good evening. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, it's nice to be here. I'm speaking from a cold, wet, and windy Scotland.
Oh, good. You're gonna host the world if we show up in person in Glasgow in November.
And I'd love to share my taste of whiskey with Professor Sachs.
Great.
But it's a pleasure and honor to be invited to ask a question today. And thank you for your chosen books and the fascinating insight they provide into the political games played by past leaders in the US and the UK. But if their actions are reflected by our present day leaders, does it not ring alarm bells for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? The political self-interest will always predominate over cooperation for global goals. I believe Trump never even mentioned them during his presidency. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Well, we barely survived Trump. Trump is a psychopath. And just as nasty a man as we've ever had in the office of the presidency. And I didn't know, nobody knew really what would happen. In the end, he actually tried an insurrection, for God's sake. But he was a really dangerous man. And we're not done with that yet. And the problem, I think, actually comes back to the color of law in an important way. There's a lot of nastiness in US society, and it's been there for forever, basically. The US was founded as a slave-based society. The slavery was of unbelievable cruelty. The United States is the only country I know that had to fight a war to end the slavery. Britain ended slavery in 1833, and slave trade before that. The United States had a civil war to end slavery. And after the end of slavery, we have the story that Rothstein told, an apartheid regime that was every bit as apartheid as South Africa. Which became the archetypal apartheid regime, but that was the United States as well. Then we had the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and we were told, well, that's all over, but it isn't over because we're still battling the same evils, and Trump represented a white supremacist part of America, and we're not done with this story yet. So when I hear America's the greatest country in the world, I say, shame, just stop. It may be very powerful, but don't say these things, because there are many, by the way, there are many wonderful things, because the flip side of America is this great cultural diversity that came of a continent of immigrants. But the dark side is genocides of Native Americans and a culture of racism that is deeply embedded in a lot of the country. So we're not done with this story. And I think America has been pretty violent because of this. And the gun culture is absolutely related to this. We're going to hear from a historian later this year, a wonderful history that explains how this Second Amendment right to bear arms is related to having been a slave society and a murderous society against American Indians and so on. So then one asks, well, shouldn't we be able to achieve something? And the answer is yes, but it's a close call. And civilization is a close call. It's why I'm always a bit of a nervous wreck, I would say, not to make everyone a nervous wreck, because you just cannot predict, ever improvement. What my line has been throughout my career is we could do so many amazing things, but don't count on it as an automatic. It's one of your great countrymen, Adam Smith, almost left the impression that it's an invisible hand. It's a more sophisticated issue than that, but there's no invisible forces that make the good outcome. And we have to work very hard at it. And I think it's one of the lessons of these books, the fragility of all of this, how we can get things very seriously wrong. That's why I'm advising people to read them, not to despair, but to protect against the dark side. Why I say every time I hear, the anti-China rhetoric and so forth, it really rankles me, because I know how dangerous, how fast it can escalate, how dangerous it is, how casual it is, how the congressmen that attack China in the United States have never been to China. They know nothing. They're ignoramuses. I know them. These people, they know nothing, and yet they're the congressmen, and they are in crusades against China. So this is part of what I'm hoping we can do, which is gird up our knowledge and also gird up our ethics to understand that you don't get to cooperation without a lot of hard work, a lot of talking. And I believe it's possible because, after all, we do make progress in many important areas, but it requires really emphasizing the common humanity all the time, because our instincts seem to be not in that direction often.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I hope a lot of us are gonna be, are you in Glasgow or Edinburgh or nearby?
Oh, I think we lost Paul.
Yeah, Paul dropped.
But I'm conscious that we're at the end of this session, Jeff, because you have other commitments as well, right?
I do, and let me thank everybody for participating in the book club. Tell your friends. Oh, Paul is back. I just wanted to know where you are.
I was taken off. Sorry. Glasgow's only half an hour on the train for me, so I would definitely like to try and make it if I can to COP26. Although I'm not sure that Boris Johnson is convinced it's still going to go ahead because of COVID this November. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, it's really important that the meeting take place, even if it has to take place virtually. It's really important that we not lose another year of the negotiations. But I hope we can be in Scotland. That's my plan, at least. So,
it'd be lovely to meet up with you as well.
Very good. If you see me around, walking around, say hello.
I'll have my kilt on.
Fantastic, Paul. Thanks a lot. And let me say to everybody, thank you for joining today. Thanks for the chance to be with everybody. I do have to run because a meeting came up in just the last couple of days to work on global diplomacy. So I'm going to have to duck off at this point, but I will see you at the next book club. And Florencia, if you can remind us, it's April
26th of April at 9 a.m. and we're going to have the conversation with Mariana Mazzucato on her new book, Mission Economy.
She's absolutely terrific. So everybody will really enjoy that discussion. Thanks a lot, everybody, and see you soon.
Please.